Hi, welcome to another episode of Data Pancakes. In this episode we will be discussing personas, what they are and how to map these roles to roles within a solution like Microsoft Fabric. One of the key steps in effective data management and governance is establishing a data governance framework. This framework usually describes roles, responsibilities, processes, as well policies involved in managing and governing data within your organization. By establishing such a framework, you ensure everybody is involved and knows what their responsibilities are and how they fit in the larger picture. This policy or this framework can be a document or a set of wiki pages or even a presentation. An important part of this framework are the personas, and a persona is briefly a profile that describes the responsibilities a person might have within the organization. These personas may include data stewards, business users, and others. It's important to note that these personas and also the names usually differ between organizations, so there might be few or more depending on your company's size, maturity, or other regulatory requirements, for instance. Mapping data governance roles and personas to a technology solution can be quite difficult, as you will also see within this episode, because technology solutions often come with their own set of roles and responsibilities, and these roles and responsibilities might not perfectly align to the roles and responsibilities you might have within your data governance framework or within your team. So now we know what personas are, let's continue. But before we do so, let's do a quick recap first. Well, for the recap, let me bring up a slide. So this is the slide we previously used for identifying and studying our business domains. So as a best practice or a methodology, we use business architecture for looking at our core business functions, business processes, and using these to study what applications logically belong together. So from that, we identify different domains for a fictitious airline company. And two of those we used as an example. So here you see air flight operations management and baggage handling management. So two business domains from this more conceptual diagram on the left. Within, you see, well, there's an application domain. So these might be your operational systems, Azure SQL, for instance. And this is the application that holds all of your data. There's a domain model, which we can use for describing the context of this domain. It's all business concepts. And there will be a data domain. And what Sarat previously demonstrated, that within a solution like Microsoft Fabric, we can establish or implement multiple data domains even. So we implemented a data domain for arrivals and another one for departures. And then likely within each domain there will be workspaces, so a logical boundary which we can use for managing all artifacts, such as data pipelines or notebooks, for instance. At the top you see a small icon here. So this is the user group or the domain that represents the whole air flight operations management domain. And this is where usually our personas would sit within. So if we carry on and we go to the next slide, so what I've done here, so I've listed out the typical personas you might find within a usual or typical business domain. So here's an example. I use the air flight operations management. And there are some typical roles, and I would like to discuss all of these roles now one by one. The first persona typically is a business or an IT owner, or this could be the domain owner. And usually this is the person who plays a strategic role and manages the day-to-day business operations. So the head of the business department, for instance. It could be as well. Next, there's an application owner. Well, the application owner, in my view, that's the person who's responsible for the application itself. So the availability, the performance, as well maybe the SLA you establish for delivering data towards the data platform. Next, there could be a data owner. And this is usually the person who has the overall responsibility for the data itself within the application or within the data within a specific part of the organization. And this might include as well the data quality, the privacy, the controls, and maybe other requirements you set for data. There's some discussion within the data mesh community about whether this is a composite role or not. Well, in my view, I think as a best practice, it's better to split these roles apart. So have an application owner as well a data owner. Within the organization, it might be very well that these two personas are actually the same person within your organization. But in other cases, it might be very well that you have one single shared application and maybe multiple data owners taking accountability over the data that's managed within this application. So in order to have that flexibility within your organization, think about maybe defining two different roles within your framework. Next, I see within some organizations, there's a role called a data product owner. And this role is more, I think, geared towards really managing the outcome of all of the effort that has been put into managing data within a data platform. So the end result, so the data product, usually organizations call, that can be used for use cases and sharing data across. So in some cases, I see this is an additional role in your data governance framework. Next, there could be a DevOps engineer. So this person often is responsible for the entire end-to-end process of development, as well maintaining the applications and the infrastructure. It's also part of the data platform then. Next, there could be a data engineer. So this is the person responsible for ingesting data, preparing data, as well the designs and the data modeling activities and the development, as well the performance testing. There might be a data analyst role as part of your data governance framework. So a person who usually either collects data, processes data, or does some analytical analysis on that data. Another role sometimes I see is a report builder. So this person or this role involves the collection as well the interpretation of requirements and then the design, so the visualization of a report of that data. Another role I often see is the ML Ops or the LLM, so large language model engineer, as we would call it these days. And well, this is the person at the end responsible for managing these models, putting these models into production. And this person is also supposed to work closely with the data scientists who usually develop these models. So that's obviously the next role. So the data scientist then is the person responsible for translating the requirements, studying data, developing an algorithm, using machine learning or today large language models. Another role I often see is a data steward role, and this is more a delegate role I sometimes see as part of either the data owner or the business owner. So that's someone who helps ensuring data is up to standard, so the data quality is on an acceptable level, or data can be used in a particular context, or this is the person also overseeing maybe the data contracts or the data access as part of, I don't know, your data security framework. And at last, well, there might be maybe even a business user, so someone who uses the data in their day-to-day processes. And this person might maybe look at reports or other artifacts that are created as part of all of the activities surrounding data management. Well, these are some example roles, but as I said in the beginning, well, there might be more or less roles depending on your size or the number of teams or the maturity you have or other regulatory reporting requirements you might have. So there might be few or less. What we will do next is we will look at how to map these personas, so these typical roles, into roles as we will see them and have these in Microsoft Fabric. But before we do so, I think it makes sense to first look at the different layers or constructs we have in Fabric. So for that, I would like to pass it on to you, Sarat. Please guide us through and explain how Fabric works and what kind of areas we might have within Microsoft Fabric.
Definitely, Pete Hine. I think this is a very important piece which you need to really grasp before we get into the mapping exercise. I will explain why, right? So we are actually talking about business scopes, which Pete Hine has described, the business personas, and the exercise which we are going to do is going to map these with the technical definitions which we have or the scope which we have on the Fabric side. So to understand this, we would really need to go and dive into the different layers within Fabric. Looking into this particular slide, which we have Microsoft Fabric, and the outermost shell is basically your Fabric tenant. Fabric tenant is something which belongs to the whole organization in this case. In our example, we have our fictitious airline company. So the airline company has its own fabric tenant. Under the fabric tenant, you have multiple modules, which we will talk about like domains, right? Before we get into this, let's discuss what the top level role which you have within fabric. That role is known as the fabric administrator. So, what is an fabric administrator or that particular IT persona? It's basically an super user on the particular platform. It can do most of the stuff on your platform. It's a super role which can start setting a lot of different options which can allow or disallow users or groups to start working on certain functionalities within this particular tenant. So if you look at that perspective, we usually see that this is a role which is picked up by someone who is from the center of excellence teams, for instance, or a central global IT team, which kind of manages the whole platform. So that's basically a fabric administrator role. Next, when we dive one level deeper, we get into the concept of domains. We did discuss a lot about what's a fabric domain in the previous episode. We talked about how to implement that within Microsoft Fabric. So in this particular scenario, we are talking about different roles you have inside domains. There are two major roles which we have within domains. They're called the domain administrators, and the second one is known as a domain contributor. So let's go back to this example of our fictitious airline company. Let's say that I am actually the IT administrator who is a fabric administrator on the whole tenant. I go in and set a rule which says my firm actually allows export of data, right? So I would say I allow anybody within my tenant to export CSV files from my reports, from my Power BI reports. Next, assume that Pete Hine is going to be a persona who is actually a domain administrator. So he owns the finance domain within this particular company, within the airline company. So he, as an administrator, a domain administrator in that sense, could go and override a few settings. Not all settings, that's something which you need to keep in mind. A subset of settings which you set on the tenant side can be overwritten or overridden on the domain side, right? And these are called as delegated settings. So that's basically what a domain administrator can do. They can actually alter tenant level settings which have been delegated. At the same time, a domain administrator could also add workspaces, right? And the assignment of workspaces to a domain or assigning a capacity to a domain or manually, for instance, attaching it based on a workspace administrator, all these can be done by the domain owner or domain administrator in this case. The second role which you have within a domain is called a domain contributor. The only difference for now between a domain owner and a domain contributor is that a domain contributor actually cannot alter these tenant level settings or cannot override these tenant level settings. That's the current difference between a domain contributor and a domain administrator. So it really makes sense, right? Because these two roles are important because in a particular domain, they could have their own definition of how data needs to be used, how data needs to be exported or not exported. So those kind of things make it an easy or manageable way of assigning personas to these roles. Next up, we would go into the third piece of this diagram. That's basically your workspaces. We did discuss about workspaces in the previous example, right? In the previous episode, we talked about workspaces as containers where your work items within Fabric are stored. On the workspace, we have four different roles. These are starting from workspace administrator, then you have a workspace member, you have a workspace contributor, and a workspace viewer. These are four different roles or scopes which you have within your workspace. And a workspace administrator is basically it's an admin on your workspace. It has the ability to create your workspace, it has abilities to delete workspaces, to add new members into this, add new groups into this, and assign roles. All that is possible by the administrator. The second role in that list would be a member. A member cannot delete workspaces, right? They can add new members into your workspace. That's something which a member can do. At the same time, both the admin as well as your member, they can allow users who are on that workspace to reshare items. We will talk about sharing a little bit later. So next up, we go into the third level, which is what is called as a contributor. So workspace contributor has most of the rights which are required to read artifacts, to edit or write artifacts, and execution of pipelines, for instance, like a data flow gen 2 or pipelines, or you could talk about executing a notebook. All of that functionality is something which you get as a contributor. Last but not the least, we have the workspace viewer. And the workspace viewer, as the name suggests, is about viewing the content. So it's not about changing, it's only about viewing stuff. So these are the four primary roles which you have on a workspace. We have a different set of rules which we also encounter, right? Because 90% or 80% of your organization, you might have people who want to consume data. Let's talk about the data consumer scenario. So you don't want to expose or give them or overshare data, which is or give them access to your workspace. You only want to give them access to what they need, right? And that's where more granular permissions come in. So you have the option of sharing within Microsoft Fabric. And when you say share, they can actually read all the data using SQL endpoints. So if you're saying that I am a data consumer within my airline company, I'm coming in, I search for a data set which is important for me. If I need permissions to query on top of it, I'm a SQL user. It is possible to only share that particular lakehouse to this particular user who is requesting it. And they can actually connect to the SQL endpoint and start querying the data inside the organization. So that is something which you would do using a read on the SQL endpoint or a read on the Spark side. So if you have data analysts who are good, for instance, with Spark, they need to analyze something using a notebook, then that's also a permission which you can share explicitly, saying that these users, let's say data engineers from another team, have access on reading the data using Spark. That's basically another set of roles which you can define using the share permission. Similar to read, you have permissions to edit, you have permissions to build. Build would mean like if there is a semantic model within the workspace and report builders have to start creating reports on top of it, that is something which would be done using the share option of build, right? So this is not all of it, but there are more roles which we can define. But I think these are the most important ones which you need to keep in mind when we are designing this. There are more granular roles which you can kind of control and implement on these platforms, but we will talk about that as we go ahead. But for the mapping exercise, we do think that this is the most important piece, and these are the most important technical scopes which you need to keep in mind before we go ahead. For the viewers, right? This is a role play. So I am an IT domain lead. Pete Hine is a business domain lead. We have been tasked to kind of do this mapping, start building your data platform inside the fictitious airline company by the CXO. So the chief data officer and the information officer have tasked us to go back to the drawing board and come up with this. So now let's get back to this particular conversations which we are going to start. So Pete Hine, I'm going to say basically on Fabric, right? So discussed this earlier. A Fabric administrator is a super user.
Right.
So inside my organization, a Fabric admin could do settings. So they control the settings at the highest level and they have full access to the environment. Whom do you think is a best fit from the business perspective who can assist in this role along with my engineers?
My best guess would be is it's the IT owner. So it's not a real business responsibility. It's more IT managing the whole Fabric environment. So it would be someone from IT. It will be quite a senior person because you have
Mhm.
access to the entire environment. So it will be the global IT admin or the global IT owner, for instance.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. With that, I'll go to the second role, which I would have inside my organization. And that's what I call as a domain administrator. So, as we discussed in the previous session or the slides, we talked about an administrator who can override settings and they understand the domain quite well. They can also start assigning workspaces to this particular domain. From your perspective, which role would fit this?
Yeah, I think again it would be more an IT role. So maybe the DevOps engineer responsible for a particular domain would do this. So he or she will decide on the number of workspaces set up, development, test, acceptance, create a deployment pipeline between all of these different workspaces. So it will be, I think, that person
Mhm.
at the end performing all of these different tasks, but that person will also likely closely work together with someone from the business because the business person maybe might decide on how to organize
Mhm.
yourself really within that particular domain. So the DevOps engineer might maybe work with the business owner then from that particular domain we have identified.
Makes sense. Yeah, I would put them in there. The third piece, which I would kind of get in, is what we call as a domain contributor. So the only difference between a domain administrator and a domain contributor is the domain contributor cannot alter tenant level settings, which have been delegated. So that's something which he or she can't do, but they can definitely start putting in different workspaces, assigning workspaces to this domain. That can be done by the domain contributor. Whom do you think would be a good fit for this role?
Yeah, it could be different roles depending on how you would organize yourself. So if the main objective is building data products, for instance, it could be the data product owner in
Hmm.
that respect, deciding on how to organize this and implement this,
Makes sense.
or a data owner. But then the data owner has a more wide scope, I would argue. So if you as an organization, for
Hmm.
instance, have not defined a data product owner role and not an application owner role, it could be maybe the data owner
Makes
responsible
sense.
for doing this.
Totally. I get that piece. Yeah. The next one, which I would define along with my, at the same level in that sense, I would say is capacity admin. So ideally, a capacity administrator is someone who can, of course, have full rights on the capacity, so they can start saying like which groups, for instance, can start attaching workspaces to my capacity. So in that sense, and they are also responsible for capacity planning, right? So in that space, whom do you think would be a good fit for a capacity administrator role?
This is also the question. So who pays the bill at the end
Exactly. Yeah.
within an organization? So if it's the domain itself, so
Hmm.
they all have their own profit and loss and they do the cost management themselves. Also for IT, it could
Hmm.
be, again, I think the DevOps engineer responsible for that particular domain, since
Hmm.
that person anyhow also decides for the number of workspaces. So that person could also then do the alignment with the capacities and decide on the number of capacities to be
Hmm.
used. But if it's more general, global IT taking this accountability, it will be again the
Exactly.
IT owner, for instance. So
Exactly.
again, yeah, very much depends on how you are organized and work internally.
Makes sense. So once we have sorted out we call this as the elevated permissions, I would go into the next piece, which is the workspace, right? So inside the workspace, I have four rows. So we would start with the workspace administrator. And what does this admin do? Basically, they are a super user on a particular workspace. So going back to our example of two domains, we talked about the arrivals and the departures as two different subdomains. I could have a team one, which is working on stuff within the subdomain of arrivals, right? And a workspace administrator, in that sense, they can add users, they can remove users, they can decide who can view your content, who can edit your content. Basically, they have full controls over that workspace. So, whom do you think, in that perspective, would be a workspace administrator?
Yeah, there might be even different workspaces then.
Hmm.
So one for development, test,
Exactly.
acceptance, and another one for
Exactly.
production. So it also depends a bit again how you are organized. So for production, I would say yeah, that's the real production environment.
Yeah.
Likely a business user then. So that could be a data product owner or data owner or a business manager. And then for the workspaces for development, test, and acceptance,
Hmm. Hmm.
those could be potentially then again different users within the organization.
Definitely. Yeah. There was one more piece I would like to discuss, right? So, a workspace administrator is a role which needs to be available for deployment pipelines. So, if you need to do CI/CD, then basically you have to be a workspace administrator to define those pipelines. So, from your perspective, do you think that the DevOps engineer also in that space?
Yes, yeah,
Exactly. So, I would just
absolutely.
put in,
So
yeah,
then, yeah,
I would just put the DevOps engineer
but
in
that
here.
DevOps engineer then likely will closely work together with the business, deciding on what
Exactly.
users will be added to what workspace.
Exactly,
Right?
exactly.
Yes.
Correct. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. The next piece of this is workspace members. And the difference between a member and an administrator is that members cannot actually remove other people onto this particular workspace. They can add people from a member level and lower, but they cannot remove other people. So that's the major difference between an administrator and a member in that side. They could do everything else. Everything else can be done by a member as compared to an administrator. So from your perspective, whom do you think could be a workspace member?
Then this to me feels more like a delegate role. So if the
Exactly.
DevOps engineer then would set up the workspaces first and do
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
assignment, and is the administrator, it could be the data product owner, the data owner, or product owner in that respect.
Exactly. So I would just paste it as a data product owner. The next piece which we have is the call this as the workspace contributor. And usually a contributor is a role which is they cannot add or remove members, but they can actually view content, they can edit content, they can create new content. All that is possible using a contributor role. So from your perspective, which personas would fit this particular role or permission?
So people who really do the work then.
Exactly.
So data engineers, report builders, data scientists, the LLM or machine learning ops, ML ops engineer, for instance. I
Yeah.
don't think business users fit really into this one because they more often only look at reports.
Hmm.
So they
Hmm.
have read
Hmm.
only access rights and they don't contribute or edit or create new artifacts. So more
Definitely.
actually the people doing that work.
Okay, so I would summarize it as data engineers who, of course, need to build Spark notebooks, ETL, data integration engineers for the ingestion piece, MLOps engineers, like you mentioned, and data science personas. I think this kind of fits the bill, right? In that sense.
Yeah, there could be an exception maybe, perhaps
Hmm.
when
Hmm.
you would like to do self-service.
Right.
So you create an empty workspace just for
Hmm. Hmm.
self-service.
Hmm.
In that
Hmm.
workspace, there will be read-only shortcuts, for instance, and there might be then power users
Right.
working within that workspace. So
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
those will be business users as well. But that's again, I think, more an exception. And also
Right.
depends a bit on how you are organized internally.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah. So the last piece of the workspace rules which I have is actually a workspace viewer. And as the name suggests, viewers only have read-only access to most of the artifacts. They cannot edit any stuff. They can actually view content inside the workspace. So from your perspective, which roles do you think would be best designed, or which personas would be best designed for this?
Yeah, I think either a data steward, and if you
Hmm.
don't have a data steward defined, it could be the data owner or the data
Hmm.
product owner, eventually looking over all of the artifacts that are created
Hmm.
within a workspace. But
Hmm.
safest, I would call a data steward.
Yeah. So I would say a data steward then. Yeah. So I think this kind of summarizes the main piece of the puzzle. The next piece is there are many scenarios where you don't want to give your users rights onto the workspace, right? We also discussed this in the previous slide. We said like in maybe 70% of the scenarios, you have consumers, data consumers, who would need access to your data, but they really don't need access to the items to create new stuff within your workspaces. And that's when we come up with the concept of sharing, right? So we talked about this, and within sharing, we have different roles, right? So within sharing, you have a build permission. So this would mean I could actually open up my workspace, not opening up the workspace, but I could open up my semantic model or data set, it was previously called, to a business user to come in and start building reports on top of it, like a BI developer, right? So in that space, which persona do you think would be actually apt for sharing?
Ah, okay. Now I get it. So this could be a business user then, but more the power user
Yeah.
or a report builder.
Hmm. Hmm.
But again, a report builder, depending on the responsibility and scope, it could also be a workspace member. But I think again, it depends a bit on how you define these personas internally
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
what reach you would give them.
Right. Totally. Totally. The next piece within sharing is also I could share it, but then I could share it with a read only permission. When I say it's a read only, it could be different things, right? So you could have a read only to look at the SQL endpoint, which means that I could use the SQL endpoint to access the data using TSQL, for example. I can query the data. The second piece of read is through Spark. So do I want to access the files and I want to use it within a notebook? That is a second read only scenario. So, and then you could also think about Lakehouse Explorer, where you want to explore, for example, the file explorer, which you have within Fabric. That would also need these rights. So, from your perspective, which personas would need this role within the organization?
Yeah, again, depends a bit on the scenario. So it
Mhm.
could be a data analyst when you
Mhm.
talk
Mhm.
about SQL, or
Exactly.
but in the scenario you had just mentioned, so building a notebook, I would not assume well that will be a data analyst. So that will be more, I think, a data scientist then
Mhm.
in that
Mhm.
particular example. In other cases, maybe a real power user. So we have trained users within the
Right.
business, and
Mhm.
those
Mhm.
are qualified as real power users, and they could do a bit more than just opening up a report, but also building some stuff really, or performing some lightweight SQL queries.
Right. Yeah, so I think in the first level of mapping, we have kind of covered a lot of ground in which personas can get mapped into different roles on Microsoft Fabric. What would happen after this exercise is typically I, as an IT domain lead, would kind of pass this over to particular DevOps engineer and the team which is tasked with this. And typically, what happens is that Entra IDs or groups would be created. So Entra groups would be created, and these groups would be tagged to particular personas or people. And then we start really mapping that into the platform as such so that we have the whole coverage. So that's an exercise which we would do after this piece.
Yes, thank you, Sarat. So we looked at domains, business domains. We learned about the different personas. And again, I would like to stress out, importantly, is that these personas might differ. So there might be more or less depending on how you are organized. And as an exercise, you should do list out these different personas and clearly mention so what are the roles and responsibilities they would have. Also on that life cycle of managing data, so from data creation, origination, the ingestion into a data platform, all the way up to data usage. So map the responsibilities from these individual personas to that life cycle and describe it clearly. And then next, when implementing a platform, something like Microsoft Fabric, you should again do an alignment or a mapping. So the personas you have defined internally, how would these map based on the roles and responsibilities you have given to them? How would these map then to the different roles and responsibilities you have within Fabric? So create that framework and build it out is really essential. And this is one part of the exercise we have done. So we only have done this for Microsoft Fabric. But in the next episode, we will look at another service called Microsoft Purview, our end-to-end data governance solution. And we will look again, so how would these different personas map into the roles you would have typically within a product like a data catalog, so Microsoft Purview. So hope you enjoyed and learned a lot, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.